Okay, so ever get that feeling like, ugh, the price of everything is just going nuts?
Yeah.
Well, get ready, because today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into U.S. monetary history with Carola Binder's Shock Values.
Oh, great book.
And trust me, you'll see this whole price chaos thing. It's not just a now problem.
Yep.
America's been wrestling with this since, well, basically since day one.
It's a theme, isn't it? And what I find so fascinating is how it's not just about, like, numbers on a spreadsheet, you know?
Right.
It gets at these really fundamental tensions, like at the core of the American experiment, freedom versus stability, individual rights versus like what the government can do. Binder does a great job showing how those tensions, how they pop up again and again as different groups are dealing with inflation, deflation. Nobody's ever quite happy, are they?
Yeah, it's like, imagine for a second you're a farmer, right back in the early U.S. land.
Yeah.
Crops, that's your whole life.
Absolutely.
But those prices are all over the place. You could be booming one minute, bust the next. Meanwhile, a merchant, they might be doing just fine.
Different sides of the same coin.
Totally. And Binder really emphasizes how even the founding fathers, they were worried sick about this. They saw how those price swings could pit farmer against merchant, debtor against creditor.
Recipe for disaster.
Totally. Like, it could rip the whole young nation apart.
And those anxieties, that fear of instability, it fed directly into this huge debate about what kind of monetary system the U.S. should even have. I mean, think about the first Bank of the United States, the second bank. These were big swings at trying to, like, inject some order into this wild west of early American finance.
Right, because it wasn't like they had a blueprint for this.
Exactly. It was all brand new. And so the question becomes, were these banks serving everyone equally, or were they just propping up a select few? That's a debate that never really goes away.
And then, boom, you've got Andrew Jackson writing in this champion of the common man, at least that's how he's remembered.
A complicated legacy, for sure.
And he took on the second bank, basically saying, hey, you're just favoring the wealthy elite.
Which played right into all those anxieties we were talking about. Who controls the money? Who benefits? These questions were huge, GE.
It's like this constant power struggle, right? And we're still dealing with it in different forms today. But back then, you've also got this backdrop of constant economic turmoil, land prices going haywire, crop prices, you name it. People were losing faith in paper money, in anything that seemed even remotely like manipulated.
Right, because if the very ground beneath your feet, literally and economically, is constantly shifting, how do you build anything stable?
Exactly. So it makes you wonder, what did people even think money was back then? Was it gold, silver, this newfangled paper stuff?
Right, it gets to the very heart of it, that struggle for stability.
Yeah.
And you see it play out in those debates about what should back the currency, gold, silver, both. It got really heated.
Oh yeah, the bimetallism folks, they had some strong opinions.
They did. Farmers especially, they got hit hard by deflation after the Civil War. So they saw silver, which was cheaper than gold, as this way to increase the money supply, boost prices for their goods.
Makes sense. Make things a little less scarce, a little more valuable.
Exactly. And you had these really charismatic figures like William Jennings Bryan, remember him? Cross of Gold speech.
Oh yeah, history class flashbacks.
He was a powerful voice for bimetallism. He argued that tying the country's fortunes to gold only benefited the wealthy, that it was crushing everyday Americans.
And that image of Bryan railing against the gold standard, it reminds you that these economic debates, they're not just academic exercises, they're about real people's lives.
Absolutely. And at the same time, you have economists like Irving Fisher trying to find more scientific solutions. He was all about stabilizing the dollar's purchasing power.
Instead of just pegging it to like the whims of gold.
Exactly. He wanted to make sure a dollar bought roughly the same amount of stuff over time, regardless of what gold was doing.
Interesting. So kind of a more hands-on approach, managing the system.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, all of this is happening as the U.S. is industrializing like crazy, cities are booming, the world is changing fast.
Talk about a recipe for uncertainty.
Right. And that brings us to this pivotal moment, 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Ah, the Fed. Everyone always talks about them in hushed tones, but I feel like nobody actually understands what they do.
Right. It's a bit mysterious, but here's the thing. When the Fed was first created, it didn't even have this clear mandate for price stability. Like, that wasn't job number one.
Really? So what were they supposed to do?
It was more about keeping the whole financial system running smoothly, providing a backstop for banks, that kind of thing.
So they were more like a financial referee.
In a way. And they were supposed to help with employment, too. Talk about a balancing act.
Yeah, right from the get-go. Keep the economy humming, keep inflation in check. I can only imagine the pressure, especially with, something like the Great Depression looming.
Oh, and the Great Depression really put the Fed to the test. They couldn't prevent that economic freefall, and suddenly everyone's looking for answers.
Desperate times, desperate measures.
Right. Did you know that President Roosevelt even considered, going back to bimetallism, using silver to try to pump up the currency?
Wow, so even with this new institution, the Fed, those old debates about gold and silver, they were still swirling around.
Oh, absolutely. It was ingrained in the American psyche, this idea that you needed something tangible backing the currency.
Makes sense, I guess. People want something real to hold on to, especially when everything else feels so uncertain.
Right. And then, of course, World War II hits. And again, the government's facing a whole new set of economic challenges. Remember those price controls from the Civil War?
They're back.
Back in a big way, especially for essential goods like food.
It's wild how history just seems to rhyme,
It really does. And this time, it wasn't just about the war effort. The whole New Deal era had been about the government taking a more active role in managing the economy, right?
Right, like big-time government intervention.
Exactly. Roosevelt's New Deal programs, they aimed to put people back to work, provide a safety net. It was this massive expansion of government power.
Which, of course, ignites this whole other debate. Where do you draw the line? How much government is too much?
It's a question that never goes away, does it?
Nope. How do we balance the needs of the many with the rights of the individual? How much power do we give the government to shape those outcomes?
Big questions. And as we move into the post-war era, those questions, they only get more and more complicated. But we'll save that part of the story for after we take a quick break.
So last time we were talking about the U.S. government wrestling with these really fundamental questions about money and power after the Civil War. Did things get any clearer as the country entered the 20th century?
Well, not exactly. If anything, you could say the plot thickened. Remember those early ideas about money we talked about, like mercantilism, where everyone was hoarding gold like it was going out of style?
Oh yeah, good times.
Right. So as we move into the 20th century, a new idea starts to gain some serious traction, the quantity theory of money.
Okay. Remind me about that one again.
So basically, it says that the more money there is out in the world, circulating, the less each little bit of that money is actually worth.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like supply and demand, right? If you've got a ton of something, it's not as valuable.
So print too much money and suddenly your dollar doesn't buy you as much bread at the store. Inflation.
Bingo.
Yeah.
And this theory, it really shook things up because it meant that just pegging your currency to gold, that wasn't necessarily the answer to this price stability thing.
More complicated than that.
Way more. And this sparked all sorts of new debates. Remember bimetallism?
Oh yeah, the great, should we back our currency with gold, silver, or both throwdown? Seems like such a simple question, but people got really fired up about it.
They did. Farmers especially, they got hit hard by deflation after the Civil War.
Prices for their crops tanking. Tough times.
Absolutely. So they saw silver, which was cheaper than gold at the time, as this way to pump up the money supply, increase the volume, boost prices for their goods.
Makes sense, I guess. Make their stuff a little less scarce, a little more valuable.
Exactly. And they had some really powerful voices on their side. Remember William Jennings Bryan? You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
Oh yeah, vaguely. High school history class, maybe?
Well, he was a huge figure in the bimetallism movement, argued passionately that tying the country's fate to gold, it only benefited the wealthy, that it was hurting everyday Americans.
And that image, right, Bryan, up there on his soapbox, railing against the gold standard. It's a good reminder that these economic debates, they always have a human cost. They're about real people's lives.
100%. And it wasn't just fiery speeches either. At the same time, you've got economists like Irving Fisher. He was really trying to find more scientific solutions to this whole price instability problem.
So less politics, more like data and equations.
Exactly. He was all about stabilizing the dollar's purchasing power.
Instead of just pegging it to, I don't know, the price of gold and hoping for the best.
Right, forget about gold. Let's focus on making sure a dollar today buys roughly the same amount of stuff tomorrow, no matter what happens in the gold market.
Interesting. So kind of a more hands-on approach to managing the system.
You could say that. And keep in mind, all of this is happening while the U.S. is industrializing at a breakneck speed. Cities are exploding. The world is changing fast.
Talk about a time of upheaval.
Total upheaval. And that brings us to a pretty pivotal moment. 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Ah, the Fed. It's like everyone's heard of them, but nobody actually knows what they do.
Right. Mysterious, powerful.
A little intimidating.
For sure. But here's the thing. When the Fed was first established, it didn't even have this, clear mandate for price stability.
Really? So what were they supposed to do if not keep prices under control?
It was more about keeping the whole financial system stable, like being a lender of last resort for banks, preventing panics, that kind of thing.
So more like a financial referee than anything else.
In a way, yeah. But they were also supposed to, keep an eye on employment, too. So from the very beginning, it's this balancing act.
Right. Keep the economy humming, keep inflation in check, make sure everybody's happy. Must have been a lot of pressure.
Oh, yeah. And then, of course, you have the Great Depression. Talk about a trial by fire.
Yeah, I can't imagine that was good for anyone's stress levels.
It really put the Fed to the test. They couldn't prevent the collapse, and suddenly everyone's looking for answers, for someone to blame.
And the Fed was an easy target.
Right. And did you know that President Roosevelt actually considered, bringing back bimetallism, dusting off silver to try to inflate the currency and get things moving again?
Wow, so even with this brand new institution, the Fed, those old debates about gold and silver, they just wouldn't die.
It's like this ghost that keeps coming back to haunt us, this deep-seated belief that money needs something tangible behind it.
I guess when the world feels uncertain, people want something solid to hold on to. Makes sense.
It does. And then, of course, World War II kicks off, and once again, the U.S. government's facing a whole new set of economic challenges. Price controls.
Here we go again.
Right back in the mix, especially for essential stuff. Food, gas, you name it.
It's like history just keeps repeating itself.
It really is amazing, isn't it? But this time around, it's not just about wartime shortages. You've got the whole New Deal legacy looming large, right?
The government getting really involved in managing the economy.
Exactly. Roosevelt's New Deal programs, all those efforts to put people back to work, to provide a safety net, they were hugely controversial.
A massive expansion of government power. Some people loved it, some people hated it.
And that tension, that fundamental question of how much government is too much, it just keeps popping up.
Where do you draw the line between, helping people and interfering with the free market? It's a debate that never really goes away.
And as we move into the post-war era, those questions just get more and more complicated, but we'll have to dive into that after a quick break.
Okay, so we've gone from, hoarding gold to battling the Great Depression, price controls, the New Deal, the works. It's a lot.
It really is.
So as we hit the post-World War II era, what's the next big chapter in America's quest for, a stable economy?
Well, the U.S. comes out of the war as this economic powerhouse, right? But this whole thing about finding the right balance, making sure the economy works for everyone, that's far from over. And this is where the Federal Reserve, that kind of mysterious entity we talked about.
The one everyone's whispering about.
Exactly. This is where they really step into the spotlight.
So the Fed starts, flexing its muscles a bit more. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, think back to the Korean War. Price controls, they make a comeback.
Oh, those old chestnuts.
Right. Echoing those earlier eras. But this time around, the results are, mixed.
Not quite the magic solution anymore.
Not really. It became pretty clear that just trying to, dictate prices from above, it has its limits.
Yeah, it's like playing whack-a-mole with the economy, right? You try to control one thing and something else just pops up unexpectedly.
Precisely. And politically, this plays out in this real tug of war between the U.S. Treasury and the Fed. The Treasury, they're often driven by the political needs of the moment, right? So maybe they want to juice the economy, spend a bunch of money.
Get those approval ratings up.
Exactly. But the Fed, they're supposed to be thinking more long-term, right? They're worried about inflation getting out of control.
That classic tension between short-term gains and long-term stability. It seems like every time the government tries to, fix things, there are these unintended consequences just waiting in the wings.
It's like clockwork, almost. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the 1970s. Enter stagflation. That awful combination of high inflation and high unemployment.
Oh, yeah. I've heard economists talk about this like it was some kind of economic nightmare. What exactly went wrong?
It's like everything economists thought they knew about how inflation and unemployment worked, it just went out the window. You know the Phillips curve, that idea that you could kind of neatly trade off one for the other?
Vaguely.
Well, it totally broke down. Nobody saw stagflation coming.
So the old playbook was useless. What did they do?
Well, that's when Paul Volcker walks in. He was the Fed chair at the time, and he was not afraid to make some tough choices.
Volcker. That name's like in every economics textbook ever.
For good reason. Volcker understood that to crush inflation, you had to be willing to, really grab the reins. He hiked interest rates like crazy.
Which probably didn't make it very popular at the time.
Oh, it was painful. Triggered a recession, in fact. But it worked. Inflation came down.
Wow. So a tough pill to swallow, but it cured the disease.
Pretty much. But it was a powerful lesson, right? It really solidified the Fed's role as this, guardian of price stability, even if it meant making tough calls that not everyone would like. And it ushered in an era of more transparency.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
After the whole stagflation debacle, people probably wanted to know what the heck the Fed was doing.
Exactly. No more operating in the shadows. And this push for transparency, it eventually leads to the Fed adopting an actual explicit inflation target, 2%, that magic number you always hear about.
So that everyone knows what they're aiming for. No more guessing games.
In theory. Provide a little more certainty, a benchmark for how the Fed's doing, but of course it's never that simple. The debate continues. Should the Fed only be focused on inflation? Or should they also be looking at things like employment, inequality, climate change even?
It's a lot more than just numbers on a balance sheet.
Right, and you have groups like Fed Up. They argue that full employment, even if it means slightly higher inflation, should be the top priority.
Because for a lot of people, having a job, that's more important than a tiny increase in the price of milk.
Exactly. And then just to make things even more complicated, throw in a global pandemic. The Fed pumps trillions of dollars into the economy to prevent a total meltdown.
Emergency measures.
Exactly, but one side effect. Inflation spikes again. So here we are, still wrestling with these fundamental questions.
How much should the government be involved in the economy? What are the trade-offs? What's the right balance? It's something we're still figuring out.
Absolutely, and all of this history we've been talking about, it's not just ancient history, it's playing out right now. President Biden's facing pressure over rising prices, debates about using the strategic oil reserves, those price caps on prescription drugs. It's all connected.
Wow, so it's like this living, breathing thing that affects all of us every single day.
Exactly, and that's what I find so fascinating about it. By understanding these historical battles, these constant tensions between freedom and stability, government action, and market forces, we're better equipped to understand the challenges and the opportunities that we're facing right now.
It's like the next time I see a headline about inflation or the Fed doing, whatever it is they do, I'll know it's not just some abstract economic thing. It's a story about power, about people, and about the choices we make as a society.
Perfectly said.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into U.S. monetary history. It's been quite a ride.
It always is.
But hey, thanks for coming along for the journey. And remember, the past isn't just prologue. It can be a powerful tool for understanding the present and maybe even shaping the future.